Welcome to the podcast. My name is Jory. I was talking to a journeyman about the history of the Union. Well, he was talking to me and educating me, and this prompted me to do a little research, and I was handed a book. And this book is called The Rise of the United Association by Martin Segal. Great book. And it covers, in this book specifically, between 1884 and 1924, but there are some dates in here that precede those numbers, and that's fine. But why am I reading it? Well, sometimes it's better to read a book with your ears. It's 2019, bruh. So, getting into the pipe crafts, what they cover here in the first one are plumbers, steam fitters, and gas fitters. Now, in the early 1880s, the local unions of plumbers, steam fitters, gas fitters, they're making their first attempts to form national organizations. And by the mid-1920s, the United Association has been in existence for about 3.5 decades. And it's one of the strongest organizations in the building trades and in the AFL. So we get into the plumber, and they happen to be the sorry guys. So the plumbers make up 70% of the craftsmen at this time. Steam fitters at 20% and gas fitters at 10%. And the plumbers are the oldest of the three crafts, and I'm going to start with that one first because a lot of them deal with the same material and started off the same in terms of how they're working, and I'll get into that right now. And I'll distinguish them according to the book. So plumbers originates from the Latin term, I don't know if I pronounce this correctly, but plumbum. Plumbum. It's spelled Plumbum, which is Latin for lead, because traditionally plumbers worked with lead. It's a material that's malleable and it has a low melting point, so they're able to shape it fairly easily into pipes and joints, fixtures, whatever they needed. So the early American plumbers made articles out of lead, installed in buildings, and in the decade of 1840s, the cities installed municipal systems that supplied water and sanitary drainage that connected to public sewage systems, and these made it made it possible for plumbers to install their fixtures. So they would be able to join the outside water and drainage systems, and this helped the plumbers with their scope of work. It increased. So instead of being a basic worker in lead, he became a craftsman that primarily removed and installed waste and sewage and water supply. So now we get to the 1860s, and pipe is now being manufactured commercially. Although it's being manufactured commercially, the plumber still had to make his own fixtures by hand, make his own traps, make his own joints, and water hydrants, service boxes for closet tanks. This just increased the scope for plumbing. So the 1870s, more technology is coming along. Code, even though they didn't call it code yet, they introduced vents. That goes in the scope. 1880s, 1890s, sinks and bathtubs are being manufactured. But now they're being manufactured with enameled cast iron. Also, China water closets with flushing, built-in traps. So this produces a higher standard of sanitation. So this increases the demand of the plumber, but it ended the role as making the fixtures and making the fixtures. 1870s, they start to switch to cast iron. They find it's more resistant to corrosion, so they're using that instead of lead and soil and waste pipe. 1880s, 1890s, galvanized wrought iron is introduced as a means of water supply. Also, cast wrought iron fittings appeared. By the early 20th century, more fittings, rubber washers, brass tubing comes along. So what this means is they got less shop time for the plumbers and more job site time. So now the plumber's scope really is a mechanic concerned with installation rather than making all the articles and fittings. So going into the steam fitter now, you got to understand that they're doing basically the same stuff, the same material. However, the steam fitter, his scope of work is installing, connecting pipe, valves, fittings, traps, radiators, and boilers that constitute the heating system of industrial plants and buildings. So as improvements were made in the design and equipment, the work of steam fitters become more complex. Now, although their installation of heating systems was far most of the work for steam fitters, by the 1880s and 1890s, the fitters were also employed on other types of installation, and the most important one proved to be refrigerating equipment. So in the northern part of the country, mechanical refrigeration was being widely introduced in breweries, and meatpacking plants. And in the south part of the country, refrigeration machines were used in the manufacture of ice. So as the growth of refrigeration was on the rise, also the demand of craftsmen known as steam fitters was on the rise. Now we go into the gas fitter. So their origins are about 1820 to 1850, where gas lighting was introduced and was spread into major urban areas. During the early years, the installation of gas piping within the building was done by plumbers and tinners, but gas fitting involved a more limited range, so no traps, and some journeymen began to specialize in the installation. Come 1880s, the gas fitters were well defined, so they were cutting, fitting, and installing piping that distributed gas inside the building, installing gas fixtures, testing of the system for leakage, and connecting tubes and gas fixtures with gas pipes. Now, in addition to journeymen, we also had helpers and apprentices. The relative position of these workers in the crafts are kind of described a little different here. So, the job of a helper was established in steam and hot water fitting. Journeyman fitters had to lift, work with, and install heavy pipes, coils, fixtures, and they were assisted by less skilled workers, and they were called helpers. In the later years, about 1900, formal provisions were made in Union constitutions where the helpers could eventually become a journeyman. However, between 1880 and 1910, even later actually, the steam fitter's helper was not viewed as preparing someone for a journeyman status. So there was no age restriction on the helpers, and being a steam fitter's helper could and very often did become a lifetime occupation. So the steam and hot water fitters didn't have any tradition of apprenticeship training, and they actually never used the term apprentice in connection with their work. And same is true for gas fitters. Gas fitters actually normally worked without any assistance. The plumbers, they had a tradition of indentured apprenticeship, and this dated back to the English guilds. So when the plumbers still fashioned articles and pipe out of lead, made traps, a lot of the apprentices' time was spent in the shop. While the apprentices were primarily learners, they also assisted in the shops where they worked. However, during installation at the job site, the plumbers relied on the assistance of helpers. So these workers, the helpers, carried the tools, assisted in tasks requiring physical output, and as a rule, they had little opportunity to become journeyman plumbers. So as the years go by, the amount of work in the shop, starts to go away. Work performed at the site increases, not only in the amount of work, but complexity. So the distinction between apprentices and helpers, it becomes blurred. And the apprentices were learning most of the skills by observing, helping, and performing their tasks during the work on site. But the helpers, while assisting journeymen, can now observe virtually the whole range of the work that the plumber performed. So, 1880s, 1890s, many plumbers start considering the term helper and apprentice synonymous. They basically mean the same thing to them. And this is acknowledged by the UA, and they considered it advisable to insert a special provision. So they stated that, quote, the term helper shall not be used in connection with the term apprentice by the United Association. So with that being said, I mean, that's coming from the book. I'm going to end it right here. I'm trying to keep these short and sweet, just little snippets, and this is the first part of this mini-series we're doing here. So hopefully we'll have the next one up soon. Hope to see you guys there.